Hello, everyone. I just want to get a view of the crowd, like how many of you are students? Okay. How many of you have used USDs by now? Who doesn't know what USD is? Very good. I'll be giving a little demo of how we, as a very small studio, we're 12 people in total. I'm one of the founders, the only TD, and we have 3 producers, so we're a 3D team of around 7 to 8 people. And we started adopting USD. So this is my presentation about that, and how fun that is to adopt it. Basically, the milk is USD, and all the big studios are using it. All the small studios have been wanting to use it, and I want to drink the Kool-Aid, but they're getting suspicious because they don't want you to steal their cool stuff. But in practice, this is actually how it is, the bright future ahead with USD. It's very cool, but it's also very complex. It's like going into a nuclear detonation. A bit about me. This is me. I studied computer animation in the Netherlands. I'm one of the founders of the small studio I just talked about, Colorbleed. And I've been heavily involved in supporting our own pipeline, which was Zebra at the very beginning. And then Avalon came around. We merged into our code into that, which turned into OpenPipe and is now AYON. And I also direct movies or commercials, because that's what we do. Let me see if I can click that. Is the audio for the... OK. Let's see. So this is a little sneak peek of the type of work what we do. It's quite diverse in styles, even though we're a small team. We kind of pride ourselves in always just wanting to do something new and kind of learn from every new thing we can come up with. We're just 10 to 15 people most of the time. In some rare cases, we slightly go over with freelancers, but usually it's between 10 and 15. The demo I'm going to show you is in OpenPipe, which was the previous version of AYON. So demos might show a label named OpenPipe, but the exact same workflow that I implemented there also works in AYON. So let's talk a bit about USD. What is it? Big studios, people will be like, oh, I adopted USD in 2 minutes. I just referenced Alembics because you can actually do that, but I recommend not to do that. Some people say, I don't need to learn USD because the pipeline will solve it. In essence, a good pipeline could solve that for a bit, but it would be very good to get a general ground on what USD does, what the terminology is. Don't learn everything at once, because it will be quite complicated. So what is USD? For the 2 people in the room who raised their fingers, it's basically a file format that stores your data, which, like Alembic, could store geometry. But in essence, it's an open standard to describe 3D scenes in its entirety for animation, with support for animation. And it also can reference a layer top with strength on top of each other, which I'll go into in a bit. But it's non-destructive, which is where the layering comes in. But also, there's way more terminology. There's Hydra, variants, schemas, liver piece, asset resolution, value clips, opinions, kind, purposes, collections, edit targets, namespaces, asset resolution, and way more. So yeah, like I said, don't go in and read the book, because you'll not be able to follow along, because no one actually really knows what USD actually is. They suffer. So in essence, you could use it as a replacement for Alembic. You just store geometry data in there with some moving bits and pieces. You can put cameras in there, fur and hair, in that essence, it could just replace Alembic. But it can do way more. It can layer stuff. It can put in materials. It can have render settings that the renderer actually picks up. It has native instancing support. It can have simple skeleton rigs in a way like FMX. It can even store your render settings, like the way you want the renderer to actually have all the samples set up. And it can support volumes and other procedurals that you could customize. Or, for example, Houdini has hair procedurals that, at render time, convert the low-res hairs to high-res hairs and stuff like that. But what's more interesting is that it has a very active community. It's quite hyped. It's very popular, which is, as a small studio, quite convenient for us, because if we do bug reports, they actually reply. But some major contributors are Pixar, NVIDIA, Apple, Side Effects, and Autodesk. And they also have quite a good ecosystem of tools. There's DCC integration in Houdini, Houdini Maya, etc. But there are also some standalone tools like USD View, but there are also other like standalone tools you can actually download that are not part of the Pixar ecosystem. So what is that layering that USD offers? It basically means that someone may make some geometry, and someone else in another department says, okay, this geometry needs to have some materials that's layered on top, and it knows, or it finds the geometry and says, okay, apply the shaders on it. Then someone else comes in, and I just want to move the 2 fingers to the right. That's another opinion they can layer on top. And because it's just an opinion on just the materials or just the fingers, if someone changes the model, that will non-destructively be propagated through, and the materials will still work. Unless, of course, you change the UVs, then you're out of luck. So that's also why you would layer. And an opinion is basically just someone saying, assign a material, or change the color, or move a thing. That's what an opinion is. And then there's liver Ps, which stands for local inherits, variants, references, payload, specializes. Again, a lot of terminology. But they used liver Ps to define the strength. If a local opinion, like the current layer, has an opinion on something, it's always the strongest opinion. It will win from anything else. But if it inherits or variants or references in, ignore the terminology, but in essence, it's just, if that comes across, local will always win, and the other one will win from those below. So it's just the strength ordering. And I'm not going to explain all of them, because you shouldn't really care for now. So let's take a peek at how we used to work before USD. We're a small studio, Maya focused, have been since the beginning. We do all our modeling in there. We do use Houdini every now and then for character effects or other effects, but in essence, our work is Maya with Arnold V-Ray Redshift, and the last few years, mostly Arnold and Redshift. We do look assignments, storing the assignment of what a look is on a mesh through an identifier per mesh, which we call the CBID, which I'll explain in a bit. But there are some issues with this workflow, is that it's quite hard to build large layouts that are efficient. You can do that with Arnold proxies or Redshift stand-ins, but you can't have a renderer-agnostic instancing that would work for both renderers. And even though I wouldn't recommend it ever in production, but as a small studios, we sometimes render a part in Arnold, another part in Redshift. Yeah, so that's quite important for us, actually. Then it's quite hard to update nested assets if I have a bottle that's on a dresser or on a table, and I want the table as a set. Then it's quite hard to have just that table combination to update just the bottle version, which USD has some workflows for, which I'll also try to explain. And we've traditionally done hairs and grooms rendering via Yeti procedurals, again, mostly because Yeti supported V-Ray, Redshift, and Arnold. We could have gone Alembics into Arnold stand-ins or other procedurals, but then again, that would only work for Arnold. So let me show you a bit about how we did this before USD. There's some voices in the video. I'm not sure if the audio is.
So traditionally, we're a Maya studio, and it's a black hole we've been living in for a long time. So we usually start with modeling in Maya, and we can have as many variations or models we want in a single asset, in a single task, or a single scene. The crucial bit here is that everything requires what we call a CBID, a unique identifier for that particular mesh, so that at a later point we can identify that particular mesh. We don't care as much about the hierarchy. We can move things around, we can rename things. As long as the idea remains the same, we can later in look dev or in lighting reassign look development, for example. This has some caveats. For example, it's quite tricky to understand what this ID belongs to. We don't care whether it's the tongue, it's just every mesh needs to have a unique identifier, which gets even trickier for a modeler that just starts off and he says, hey, I want to duplicate this mesh. This duplicate will have the same idea. On publishing of the model, it will say, hey, you now have two meshes with the same unique identifier. That's invalid. You need to have a unique identifier. Now gets a tricky situation where we don't really know which of the two was the original one or the new one, and which we wanted to change. But it's always complicated because it's quite hard for an artist to understand that these relatively random IDs need to be unique and how to do that and whatever. If you have this across like models into animation scenes, why is my look assignment not working? It can be quite hard to debug because this unique identifier is just hard to put any specific meaning to. Basically, how things are named, it's completely random. Yes, we have rules that they need to have a certain suffix, but for the pipeline, really, that's not really crucial for this to work. Whenever we go into look development, we load the model up into a template like this. It just has the studio lighting of the project, and the artist just assigns the materials that they want and create the looks for it. They test rendered it a few times, and when they publish, it basically exports the materials, the render subdivisions, the geometry, and everything else into one package. And based on those CBIDs, the unique identifier, it knows, okay, this particular material belongs to this particular ID, not necessarily this mesh. It's just whenever I find something that has this ID, I know, okay, this belongs to this material, I can assign it. We don't traditionally have a layout department. Usually it's the animator who just positions all the objects in the scene. He loads whatever he needs. For example, here there's just a lot of props, loads the rig characters, positions them, and the ideas will basically come from the model and the rigs. Other than that, they can do whatever they want. They can deform the meshes with extra deformers. They can duplicate stuff around. They can move things. It's totally fine as long as this idea will remain the same. Yeah, so the artist just publishes this. For lighting, we're using the AYON workflow templates. Basically, we have some prepared hierarchies, basic lighting that are being referenced in. This also has render setup layers and everything. After loading that lighting template, this is roughly what you get. You get a scene where everything's in there, the lighting is in there. You have the render setup layers, and in each particular layer, we have the characters because they're in this particular set. So these are basically everything that needs to be combined with rows. By default, these props would not be in there. But it's just a matter of moving them into the same hierarchy or the hierarchy of rows to make sure that those will render together in the render layers that we've prepared. And from here on out, you preview render the lighting, and if you're okay with it, you're going to submit it to the farm and
go from there. Anyway, so this is a fly through on how we've worked like for the last 10 years maybe. It's quite quick. If you couldn't follow along completely, I'm available the rest of the week to discuss it. But of course, it's way more fun to discuss where it changed to. Let me see if I can actually skip the slide because it didn't work just now. Okay. Yeah, there we go. So we wanted to transition to USD. USD has like material assignments. It does a lot of that our pipeline did with our custom logic, but then inside the USD universe completely, which meant we could throw out a lot of our logic, simplify the pipeline, and actually get into the non-destructive nature of it as well. So one of the big things we want to do is throw out the whole ID logic. USD uses path-based assignments. It's just like the name of the object that defines where the shader is assigned. If someone renames an object, the material assignment breaks because it doesn't know to assign to that mesh anymore. So you need to be consistent with your naming. We were a very small studio when we started. It was very hard to get artists in line to like actually never change a mesh. We had naming conventions and everything, but having them be quite consistent wasn't super trivial. So the ID logic worked around that by being way more stable. But after 10 years, we're like, okay, maybe the benefits we got from it don't outweigh the negatives of it's quite hard to debug for artists. As a TD, I can easily find what the IDs relates to, but the artist is always like, why are there multiple IDs? Where are they coming from? Why are they from another asset? Stuff like that. So for the USD test we wanted to do, we wanted to switch to Houdini Solaris just because it's way better integrated with actual rendering USD data and manipulating that. And we wanted to do either Arnold Redshift, just because those were the renderers we're using now. We wanted to do a single project, preferably one with as few assets as possible, so that if anything went haywire during production, we would probably save our assets by just working harder, instead of having to do hundreds of assets and then redo them every time when we redesigned our USD workflow. And we wanted to transition the team step by step, introduce them a bit about USD. This is roughly how it works. Let them play. Then I'll fix the pipeline and reiterate and reiterate, which is how we usually work because we're very small. I'm close to the team. Something breaks, I can directly fix it for them. And that's how we usually work. So I started implementing workflows, tested myself, and I started, for example, with the Maya modeling workflow.
Switching to a USD workflow didn't mean that much changes to our modeling workflow, except for that now we had to be way more consistent with our hierarchy naming and the objects within them. USD recommendations for assets, they also say, okay, the top group should usually be like the root group, or they recommend using the asset name, like in this case, prop fire truck to be the top group's name. And within there, you have a geo group. That's also because you can also have materials and other stuff inside the asset. Whereas previously in our previous pipeline, it would just be the model, and we would be moving that across to different stages of production. So we had one extra layer in there that we wanted to be consistent about and should always be in there. So these top groups would basically be static, named top is the asset name and then geo. In this case, it's inside the namespace, so that from one scene, we could publish multiple contributions to the prop fire truck without having conflicts on the naming of the group itself. So because our artists weren't used to that at all, what we did is we made the creator and the publisher create that template for you. Whenever you click create here, it would create the template. It would add whatever you had created inside those groups, and you would be ready to publish for the model.
So I hope that was okay to follow along, but the way I described is that because now suddenly our assets that we're publishing also contained other things than just the geometry, we needed the actual layer in there or separation that there's a group for geo and a group for materials and everything else. There could also be even rigs inside USD and whatever. So what I try to do is it's like let the artist work as much as possible as we did before. Just click here, and then it will generate whatever is needed for the USD data. So try to take them out of having to do that manually each time, which is kind of what the pipeline is for, but still have them be able to work like they did beforehand. So the layer or the structure of the hierarchy would be auto-generated. Another thing that USD recommends is or at least they say, well, the suffixes that we've been using for years, they're not really that crucial. Things like group, or like we have _grp, that's how we always did that, to indicate that that's a group. Because USD has primitive kinds and indicators of what type something actually is as metadata. They say you don't actually need the suffixes, so we might end up actually removing those over time as well. So then I started prototyping Houdini Solaris workflow, and this is kind of where I ended up.
The look development workflow switched quite a bit because we switched from Maya to Houdini, and in Houdini we started using Solaris with USD, which is a major different workflow. Basically, how we started working with this is we load a asset, which has all the layers of that particular asset included. In this case, I'm showing you a scene that already had some published looks. And what you can see here is that this particular asset of the truck has geometry and materials. It's because it includes the model layer and then the look layer on top already. But in this case, as I do my look dev, I don't want that look to already be visible in my current scene because I'm creating it. So what you usually do is you're going to mute the look layer. In this case, we have this little mute layers mini tool that we did in HDA, where you can just say, okay, what layer do I want to disable? In this case, the look, which could be included in this particular load asset as a toggle as well. But as we develop this is how we did it now. The layer break is pretty important in Houdini. It basically means that whatever is on top of that, that's what you're loading in. But when you export from this scene, whatever's on top should not be included. It's basically as if you're layering on top of that input new data instead of including this in your output. Then here, this is basically where the most of the time spent by the artist. It's just doing the look dev, assigning the shaders, and then setting the subdivisions for this particular object. That's usually what look dev is about, designing the look for the objects. Down below, there's a bit more stuff. In this case, this was one of our testing scenes where we tried a lot of different stuff. But in essence, it just means, okay, there's some look dev kit that's incoming. We rotate the truck around, and then we just have some render settings to preview this. So this is usually relatively static. In this case, it's quite messy. What we ended up with in the end is just one HDA that's kind of like the loaded look dev kit, and then some render settings at the end. So usually it's just a few nodes in the full length for look development, and this is where the real time is spent by the artist.
So the fact that this is slightly messy is because that's kind of how our workflow works. Is I just open Houdini. I'm not a Houdini artist. We don't traditionally have Houdini lighting artists. We have one Houdini artist who's done our character effects and other effects, and the rest is all Maya. So I had to at least figure out for myself, how does this work? Then I try some things, and then I need to make a template in such a way that I can show it briefly to some of the Maya artists and say, okay, this is how Houdini works. Click there and try it, and then reiterate how can I simplify this so that even our Maya artists are able to start working in this. So that's what I built this as a template with, okay, this is where you do the look dev area, which is also what you're seeing in bigger studios, that they have bright sections with backdrops on where to work. It's just to aid artists that don't work there for years, are able to at least open the scene and see, okay, where do I need to work, what's going on. So you'll see these templates quite frequently. Is there anyone here using Blender? Sweet. Okay. So, like I said, we're not a Blender studio. We're a Maya-focused studio originally, and now trying to Houdini. But since I was looking into the USD API, I wanted to see how does this actually structure to expand, maybe supporting more applications into this workflow. I also did a prototype in Blender.
As part of the USD workflow, we also looked into adopting a bit more different applications into our workflow. For example, Blender, which we haven't used in the past as much, but we've recently had some team members join who like to model in Blender and do some other stuff in Blender. So I looked into supporting that as well. This image, however, shows exactly how much I know of Blender. This is the insides of Suzanne's head, which is completely empty. And I hate Blender because I keep getting mixed results. Blender, mixed results. Ba-dum. Okay, so basically, it works exactly the same. We need a hierarchy, which starts with the asset name. In this case, I'm working at a debug project, and the asset is called asset1. So it's called asset1 geo, and we have lovely Suzanne in there. There are no other rules than that for the USD data. So let's have a quick look on how this would work in Publisher. Basically, we select the top asset. We say create model main, and then we can publish this. Then this is maybe something that I should show you as well, is the contribution of this particular model goes into the asset. So it's basically a layered structure. These are the attributes that define that structure. It might seem complicated. There are huge tooltips that we added for the artist for each thing, but usually there's much need to change these things, but there might be some cases where you want to. But by default, it's published into a USD asset for this particular asset. The asset structure is initialized as an asset. Might also be a shot structure, but for an asset, of course, that's irrelevant. It's adding it to the layer of the department, which is the modeling department. There may be many others. By default, it's a variant. You can publish different models into the same asset, which you can toggle between variants. But in this case, it will just variant into the layer name, which is model in this case, and the variant name, which is in this case model main. So you'll have a asset that has a variant called model main, and you can, if you also publish a different variant called, for example, model damaged, then you could switch between model main and the damaged model. That's as easy as that. So then they would just click publish, and it would export this USD data from Blender.
So it's really as easy as that. I've lost no one during these, 1.5 minutes maybe. So yeah, getting into the USD terminology can be quite complex. I'm not going to explain what variants are and whatever. I wouldn't want to bother now, but you can mostly explain those types of workflows in maybe 10 or 15 minutes by just reading what it is and then thinking about how would you have worked like that before. they're quite trivial to understand, but don't try again to learn all of USD because there's just too much terminology. Basically, whenever someone published a model, it would make a model cache like an Alembic, but then in USD. But it would also put that as a layer into a asset. If someone published a look dev, they would publish the look, and that would also be layered into the asset. That meant if someone would load the asset itself, it now has the model contributed by one artist, and the look contributed by another artist. So what someone else would now load is the asset. They wouldn't load the model and then the look on top of it. They would just pick that one asset, and that's how you load basically the model with the looks, and you get the whole package at once. So working in Houdini with our shot workflow, I think we might be seeing some of that.
For our shot-based workflow, we had to basically assemble all the USD layers together in one scene. I had to do this separately from, example, the animation, because the animation artist wouldn't be working in USD data per se with the rigs, and the Maya workflow just isn't set up that way yet. You can actually nest rigs into Maya USD references, but it's a bit more complicated on how to cache those out directly into the right hierarchy and everything. But in this case, this is our Houdini workflow for shot-based workflow. Basically, in assembly, which is what we call basically the layout or the layering of these assets, the Houdini artist loaded all the props and all the assets that were relevant to the shot. That's needed because those have the model and the look dev information for that particular asset. On top of that, he loaded the animation layers, which came from Maya. This just meant, hey, put this deformation on this character, put this deformation on this truck, put this deformation on these props, just to make them move. So this is basically, if we go here, this is the input of all the assets. It does nothing. Then we layer the props and whatever on top. And then at the very end, we basically merge it with the point cache data we got from our VFX artist on set, which also had the camera. So now we can easily debug this scene and say, okay, what props do we have? What animation is put on top of that? And what's the output of that? So this is basically almost the same for each shot. This is also separate from our lighting because these tended to update quite frequently. Whenever there's an asset update, we needed to re-update the inputs here as well because we didn't have an asset resolver or any way to recursively update nested assets. That made it so that in the lighting workflow, we just had to sublayer the shot and you got everything. You got the camera, you got the characters with the look dev and everything assigned. So this, like at the very first input here already has all the look development, all the animation and all the layers that are needed. In this case, the effects artist also added a layer after assembly, which replaced hair stand-in geometry with the actual animated curves, which added fur. The lighting artist doesn't need to load that separately. It's like his contributions are layered into the shot already, which made it very easy to load up the full shot here. There was some issue with Alembics not being double-sided by default because they don't have that particular flag, and the default in USD is off for this double-sidedness. So we forced it for, I think the only Alembic data that we ended up with at the end was the Alembic that we got from the VFX artist on set for the match move. Here's a workaround where we had to force the ACES color space just for a bug in Arnold, which they have fixed now in the next beta release, but it's not yet out yet in production. Then there are some shot-specific materials like stand-in geo that had to cast certain reflections or whatever. The overall lighting for the shot, in this particular case, it's quite a complex one because we have a driving fire truck with rotating lights on top. And there's constraints to that, which is somewhat tricky still in USD, but Houdini has some tools for that, which make it okay to do. Then here we're setting the camera focus distance. There are, again, some bugs in Houdini where it doesn't really work if there's any scaling whatsoever on the camera. So we added a wrangle that no matter what, always make sure the camera scale 1. It visually doesn't change anything in your viewport. It just makes the focus distance tools work out of the box, no matter what. Then there's the render settings, and we have a lot of render layers. And this is where it really shines the procedural workflow of Solaris. Basically, this setup is reused across all of the scenes. It just means that we have the consistent output. This could very well have been a single USD file that we write out and that we layer on top of the end of each scene. But because we were designing the USD workflow, we weren't sure how much of that would persist or be the same across each shot. But in the end, it was actually pretty much the same with maybe just 1 or 2 minor tweaks, which could have just been overrides after layering a USD layer here.
So this kind of showed how, again, we started to develop or just reiterate, okay, what we were doing. And as we were going, we're developing like small templates that we could just reuse for production. So this is one of them. And the loading of the shot and that being layered is quite similar to how the asset structure works. Is like the asset has the model with the materials, but a shot might have the assets, and then on top of that has the motion of the character layered on top of it, but also, for example, the cloth or swapped out, or the clothing swapped out with a simulated version. So the lighting artist doesn't need to like, pick the clothing instead of, or the simulated cloth instead of the static cloth. It's all just because someone says, no, that clothing has to be the simulated one. The effects artist has that controls. It's his opinion. And if the layer is active, the lighting artist will have that in his scene. And the interesting thing about this is that these USD files, if you would load them into USD view, the standalone application separate of Houdini, they look exactly the same. And because the renderers like Arnold are Hydra delegates, which means like a plugin for USD, you can actually render your Arnold scenes inside USD view as well. Not that we would do that, but you can actually visualize it in Arnold there as well. Let's see. So just as a prototype, I was like, okay, how simple is this USD API? Can I make my own viewer of this data? So this is kind of what I did as a prototype.
And we also investigated developing a standalone USD editor to visualize or debug the contributions and maybe even create simple USD hierarchies and referencing assets through AYON. This is one of the prototypes that we did, which shows pretty well that the USD API and the tool sets around it makes it relatively easy to write tools like these. In this case, I think most of the effort went into actually designing the Qt interfaces, and the actual API, like exposing a viewer like this, was relatively trivial. So in this case, on the left-hand side, you're going to see all the layers that are contributed to this particular shot. I've disabled the effects layer because it introduces fur, grooms, and everything, which are quite high-res and slow. And then there's the layout, which contains our base assembly layer. In here, we have the full hierarchy of the scene, including the character, its materials, and everything, which is the actual USD data. We can see that this is is a reference to this particular path. We can click it with the left mouse button, and if we hover, we get a tooltip of what's going on. The var here says, hey, this has variants, so we can have a click there as well and say, hey, this has a look main variant and a model main variant. If there are multiple, you can actually switch between those. And of course, this actually plays back, and we can kind of like look around and navigate the scene. We can also actually use the camera that's in the scene and play that back to kind of review, okay, what does this look like? So that all works pretty well. The tool that, like this particular case, we didn't optimize it at all for large scenes. The tool also exposes some features like being able to like take a snapshot of the current view to like save it out as a screenshot, or even play blast the whole image sequence, or create a turntable of the stage. If you have an asset and you just want to render a turntable, there's some tools that we like tried to implement here. Again, these are all drafts, prototypes, and it's just playing around to see what we could do. I think the end goal is definitely that AYON offers some tools to be able to edit their USD data relatively natively, standalone from any DCC. It also includes some more sophisticated tools to look into what each layer adds to the scene and what changes it actually makes. In this case, we have quite a large scene, so it's hard to debug no matter what. But in this case, you can see that we have the different layers, the shot layers, the cloth layers. And the cloth layer, for example, is one that was added by the FX department. They did a cloth simulation. In this case, they wrote a value of none as the Arnold subdiv type to disable Arnold subdivisions, because the character's cloth simulation introduces a higher res mesh. It's subdivided already to do the simulation. So we don't want to subdivide it at render time because it's already super high res, just to get better detailed cloth simulations. And with this tool, we can basically look into any of the changes that were made.
Ooh, that's a good ending. So yeah, this is like just a prototype tool that I did, like just, okay, what does the API offer? And this took me maybe a few weeks, so like next to my other work, actually running the production, to just develop this and get off the ground. So yeah, let's see. So the idea was use these everywhere. Everyone is going to be super, super happy. This is me. Look, guys, it's awesome, and the artist is super scared. So I'm going to give it to the artists. We have publishing from Maya, Houdini, Blender, even though we don't use Blender. We could also load it into Maya, Houdini, Fusion. For those who don't know what Fusion is, it's basically Nuke, but cheap. And then it publishes into shots and assets, like I explained. We created a plugin for Deadline to render with Husk standalone, because that's not, I think, natively out there. Then we use the Lambix when we don't have used the outputs yet, because we were transitioning the pipeline. We thought, well, hey, we should just start. And in the meantime, production started. We're in an advertising industry. Commercials need to be done in 6 weeks, usually. So yeah, they already started doing the look dev in Maya with Arnold, getting approved by clients. So the transition was like, okay, we need to do this in the next week, and then see if it works, and then at some point decide whether we're going to do this whole project or not. So this looked pretty good, right? I gave it to the artists, and they were super happy. Houdini crashed all the time. We had just Houdini 20, the latest release, with the latest release of Arnold. That combination wasn't very nice, which got fixed after a while. But the first few weeks into the production, we were dealing with tons of crashes, and all the artists that came from Maya said, ditch Houdini now because it crashes all the time, which was just happened to be that particular release. And so it's just, and we didn't want to go back to Houdini like 19.5 because that didn't support a certain Arnold version that we did want to use, so it's tricky. Also because we couldn't really switch Arnold version anymore because we already started Maya look dev and we wanted to match it. So yeah. Anyway, so that was the first problem we hit. But most of the bug reports that I submitted, I think in 2 or 3 weeks, I submitted over 60 bug reports to both Autodesk and SideFX. But because there's such a hype around USD, they seem to be actually be very responsive about fix it, even Autodesk. So yeah. Then we hit some Houdini Arnold bugs, which is the bugs that I also reported. It was at a very slow startup time to start the render, which was due to it trying to reload the Material X library from our server for each individual primitive on the scene. So it will basically load like over 1 billion times, go over our server, find the Material X definitions, and reload them. It was super slow. There's an issue, or there was an issue, where the OCO, or Open Color IO environment variable, was just ignored unless you set a specific attribute on a specific node, which seemed odd because every other application out there, if that variable is set, that's the default. So I did a bug report, had a long conversation with Autodesk that, yes, it should be like that, and they were, yeah, it shouldn't, and yes, it should be. So now they changed it in the new release. That's good. And many advanced render settings from Arnold weren't really exposed super nicely inside Solaris yet. There weren't render geometry nodes for that. So what we did, because we luckily had the Maya look dev, we could just export that to USD. That would contain the attributes that we wanted to set, and then just match exactly that attribute inside Houdini with wrangles or whatever. So yeah, a lot of bugs, but they got fixed because there's quite a lot of hype around it. Then, oh my God, this is so much easier in Maya. Everyone in our team is so used to Maya, it's very hard to transition and to say, okay, this is going to work out for us. There was also a lot of comments about the Solaris render view. We're a small team, and we are quite keen on using all the features that the Arnold render view offers in Maya right next to it, like having isolate a debug mode, where you can just select a mesh, and it will instantly re-render just that part of the scene without recomputing everything else. Also, if you do an render view, like isolate a part of the view and want to render just that, Solaris clears the surrounding pixels. But you want to see that render in context of what you just rendered before. So it's like, that's a weird decision to clear the scene. I want to just render this, focus on that, change the material, but still see the context of the scene. So there's a lot of issues that SideFX should probably address, or in this case also some of it is Arnold. But it wasn't as user-friendly as we've been working with Maya. But from the procedural perspective, it's much better for many quantitative shots because it's just a procedural workflow. Then we had a lot of issues with, again, objects being renamed. We got into the same issue we got 10 years ago. Why weren't my materials assigning? But in this case, apparently our artists nowadays have been whipped hard enough to try not rename things all the time. So that actually improved, but we were just renaming bits and moving stuff around because we were designing our USD structure and thinking about how it should actually work. So that was mostly from a pipeline perspective that we moved things around. And then we had the issue that the meshes were not double-sided in some cases, but that was for Alembics. So the USD workflow is actually super stable. It's also very easy to debug, which I'll show you in a bit. And either explicitly set the double-sidedness on top of Alembics, or just ditch Alembics. It's really easier if you go to USD. Another issue we faced is that we would sometimes get double transformations if someone would write an opinion to move a thing somewhere. For example, layout, move the character, but then the vertex deformation from the animation would also move it. You'd get what if you have a Maya rig, move the group, but also the top controller. It's the usual stuff. So again, also here, you sometimes need to be aware of what opinions you're putting where. But once you understand how that works, it's actually, again, like Maya rigs. You know how they work usually. So be consistent and slightly understand what opinions or what you're actually writing about in your file. Like, what am I actually changing, and do I really want to change that? USD can also explicitly say, cancel out any existing transformations, like just ditch anything else, just do whatever this layer has as an opinion, but it's explicit, and you'll need to actually say that it has to be that, so it's a bit more involved, and is usually left to the more technical artists to do that. We had an issue where animations would just play the wrong FPS, and we're like, what? But there's a metadata that USD uses, time codes per second, to define the playback speed. I think there's time codes per second and frames per second, and there's a slight difference between the two. One is the playback speed, and one is the metadata of what it should originally have been. It's a bit of a weird description. You can read it in the terminology of USD. But anyway, you need to author time codes per second to actually not be working in 24 FPS. Otherwise, the software will think that it's actually 24 FPS. And if you load Alembic, it doesn't have that metadata. So if you load Alembics into USD, it by default will try to see, hey, that's 24 FPS, because it doesn't have the metadata. Then there is a long-standing issue and bug report, and I think a PR that fixes it on GitHub, but there's still discussion on whether that's the good way or not. And so again, it's just easier if you ditch Alembics and just try USD. And there's no notion of pivot points. In Maya, we usually just move the pivot point and then just rotate around that. There's no actual notion of having a point you rotate around. You can have multiple transformations on one object, but the lack of that means also that Solaris tools are not designed that way. The way the USD community says, you're better just making a group, moving that, and putting your objects in that, then the group is just the pivot point, which is kind of goes into that. Originally, we said, if we publish a model, it needs to have no transformations whatsoever because it's a clean model. So now I need to have the transformation as the pivot point, which kind of beats our initial design that we don't want any transformations. So yeah, these were kind of the solutions. Tell me if I go too quick, but I want to show more issues we had. So Maya has a transform with a shape underneath, but USD says, well, hey, that's not very optimized because the shape could also just have transformations. So what the Maya exporter does, it merges the shape into the transform so that you don't have the shape object anymore. It's just a transform. Sounds all great, and it's very optimized in USD, but now if you mix in an Alembic, the Alembic doesn't have that merged. So now if you have both and you layer them on top of each other, you have a mismatch in names, which shouldn't usually be an issue because if you assign a material on the transform, it will be inherited downwards. But if someone somewhere decides to just assign the material on the shape, then at the end, when we've switched to USD, that material assignment wouldn't be there because the shape wouldn't exist. It's now inside the transform. So again, drop Alembic as soon as you can. But second, what we didn't learn now is that the way USD is designed is that it's just way easier to debug when something goes wrong. It's like, for example, the red little dotted thingy or the circles, they kind of indicate that there's an opinion on this, but the object does not exist. So there's a material assignment, but I cannot assign it because the geometry is not there. So we could visually see, okay, something had an opinion there, but it's not there now, and we could easily fix it. Even artists could follow this. There was an issue with writing very large sequences of heavy caches that as Houdini or USD files are being written out, that it tries to keep everything in memory as it's writing it out. There's a workaround for that by writing USD value clips, which writes frame by frame and sort of purges the memory in a way, which is way more memory efficient. But again, it's an extra step you need to do and include in your pipeline. Because we had relatively short shots, it wasn't an issue for us. But one of our artists only actually hit this when he was on his single machine caching 5 VFX shots at the same time. And that's when he said, hey, my RAM is 128. What are you doing? Yeah, caching 5 shots, simulating 4 shots, and on one machine. Okay, well, maybe just do fewer or submit them to the farm and make it safer that way. But the nice thing about this is that this is actually something the pipeline can hide away from artists. You just need to implement it as logic, and because it's the USD API, the logic translates to, hopefully, other DCCs, as most of the logic here did. So, was there any good? Yes, the artist actually ended up quite positive with the shot workflow in Houdini. With once they had set it up, then it was super efficient. The tricky thing for us as a small studio is that we often don't have that many shots. We're doing a commercial, 4 or 5 shots. We don't want the setup time to be too long. We also often need to pitch a project, say, hey, this is kind of the stuff we're going to make. And then we're pitching, for example, an image like this on the left in a day. We don't even want to bother touching USD. We just want to make the image. So we're still doing pitches now, mostly in Maya, just because the artist is way faster in it. But the idea is definitely that as we do longer sequences, that Solaris with USD is definitely improving our workflow and optimizing that. Solaris scenes are easier to debug, like I've shown before. It's just much better than the whole ID workflow, so we're definitely ditching that. And the layered contributions is also something we really loved, where the cloth artist could say, do not subdivide this at render time. Because otherwise it would have need to be communicated from the look dev over the effects department to the lighting department or look dev and say, do not add subdivisions because the cloth will be higher res. Now, because of the layered structure, that could just be the effects artist saying, okay, do not, if this layer is active, do not subdivide it. But if the layer is inactive, it could still be subdivided for the original geometry, which is actually really nice. So, did we succeed? Yes, we did a project in USD in actually, I think 8 weeks, with maybe 2 or 3 week ramp up time to develop the ideas of the USD workflow. All final files were fully USD except for that shot or onset from the supervisor data. We used USD with Maya, Houdini, and Arnold. We did not actually use the Blender and Fusion USD tools. We just used Fusion for the renders. The draft USD viewer that I made, we didn't end up using that. It just wasn't needed for what we were doing. Plus, I didn't actually make it stable, so I didn't want to give it to the artists. And the production itself didn't use variants. I didn't explain it a lot, but a single asset could also have multiple versions of a model. So if someone had a tree, for example, they could actually just switch that tree to the other version of the tree and the other version of the tree. So you could populate a full forest with a single asset, and then at any point, any department could say, no, change that one to the larger version, because it's inside structured non-destructively in the USD data. And we did have a test of that, and I wanted to show you as much, but I can't show it yet. So that's unfortunate. What's next? Do not look at the right image. Anyway, so what we want to do from Maya is we want to animate directly into the USD data so that we can kind of skip the assembly setup where we had to first in Houdini load the full asset and then layer the animation on top. From Maya, we want to actually publish the animation directly onto the asset in the shot structure. An asset resolver, which is a technical thing from USD where you can change paths at runtime dynamically, which can make it easier for versioning, resolving different versions, or resolving cross-compatible on different platforms, or even different sites. Use value clips because of the memory issue. Material X is pretty decently integrated into USD. It's just, it wasn't at the stage yet that we could actually turn our materials that we were doing for the characters into a usable state in Material X. But it's promising, but I don't imagine that's something in the next 2 years, but maybe 5 years. Then there's OpenExec, which is Pixar saying that they have some execution engine that they did for Presto, what is it, 12 years ago or longer. And the idea is that they want to also open source that, and maybe also try and open source it in a way that it's compatible with USD, so that you can actually have an execution engine, so something that actually computes something like a rig inside USD, and that could be very interesting. But then again, that might take way too long, and then there will be a new standard, I think. Anyway, so I asked ChatGPT, how can I make this image suitable for my context? And it said, milk represents the untapped potential waiting to be utilized. Similarly, in the future, there will be numerous opportunities waiting to be milked for all they're worth. Anyway, never ask ChatGPT. OK, so if you want to read up some more about USD, on the left side, there's some references on, I think, good information that you could read up on. Then, if you use AYON, which is the pipeline I've been using here, for which we developed just USD workflows in this case, and have been a contributor in the past, these are some related USD links. On the right side, it's Colorbleed. We're not as big as all the other FMX studio presentations. We're not as big as most of the studios. We're just 12 people, but guinea pigs really like it. So I think this should have no audio. Yes, very good. Are there any questions? Silent. Do we need to pass on a mic, or? There you go.
And if you want to earn your hats, you should ask.
Oh, yeah.
Hello, thank you for the nice talk. I was wondering, how do you handle if different departments essentially update their publishes? Do you always have to go back to this assembly step and kind of manually update the versions and republish the shot file, or?
So the way the publishing works is that if a layer is published, for example, the animation layer or the lighting layer or the effects layer, that will automatically make a new shot file that has the latest version from the last publish, but then the new layer added into it and updated. So that would work perfectly fine for assets. The modeler just has to publish his model, and there would be a new version of the asset. The trickier thing comes with updating nested asset paths. Like I have an asset loaded into my shot. Then inside lighting, I just want to update the model version, which is inside the shot, inside the asset. That model version I want to swap. And there's a few ways you could work around that. Community says the best way to do that is to use the asset resolver, which is what does the dynamic repathing. Whether that's the best way for a small studio, I'll leave that up for debate. Other options are using variants, where you actually have like a huge list of variants per version, which is what Pixar originally did 10 years ago, I think, or longer. But they said for them it wasn't performant enough because it's USD still computes some of the variant sets in a way, not the full data, but it does some resolving of that. So yeah, asset resolver means you need to have a compiled plugin, which may be out of scope for a small studio, but AYON has an asset resolver for their URIs, which could make it a possibility for small studios if you're using AYON. Any other questions?
Yeah, hello. So you mentioned you're not really a Houdini artist, but you still needed to prepare all of that templates to then share to other team members. And thanks for providing links to the resources. But how much time did it take to you to really like wrap your hand around all of this?
Wrap my head around Houdini or using?
To like specifically using Houdini workflow in Houdini.
Yeah, well, I watched a lot of videos, asked people around on the Slack channels for the Academy Software Foundation, which has a USD-specific channel. Tech Artist Slack, there's also a very good one where there are knowledgeable people. I tend to ask a lot of the questions online, even on the USD Alliance forum, which is, I think, the best place now to ask questions. I did a lot of that. I knew Houdini from the fact that I had to support our Houdini artists from a pipeline perspective. So I did work with the Houdini API before, and I knew how it worked for that, but I can't make anything useful in Houdini. And then Solaris specifically, when Solaris beta came out, 18.5 Houdini, I think, we had a small collaboration with Side Effects at the time to see if we could do a demo. Then COVID hit, and we had the stupid idea to make that project a virtual production one, which was the only thing we could do where we actually had to be physically together. So COVID hit, and then we kind of canceled that at some point. But that's when I first started playing around with how USD works. And over time, I've read some more about USD. Whether you can just jump into Houdini and start using Solaris, I would recommend, if you know how Houdini works, find some templates, find some people who have done it, find a look dev kit, find a turntable setup that is automated, just so you have a reference, and then steal away. Just pick whatever you want. This is also open source. Steal it now.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I'm really glad that your little USD experiment and venture worked out for you.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you had had any experience with adding your own, let's say maybe custom metadata or information to the USD that you might use that might not be in any schema.
Yeah.
I don't know how to pronounce it exactly, because I'm also working my way into USD. I'm not exactly sure how this works. If you want to expand it with your own custom code or information that you would like to use for your own standalone. Have you had to do that, or have you thought about it? And if so, how would you go about that, for example?
It's a very good question. I'm not sure if I can say a lot about it. I've read up about how it's supposed to work. But adding just some custom metadata that you just want to persist, you don't necessarily need a schema. You can just add the attribute, because you can just add user attributes. If you just need that one particular attribute, for now, try that. And schemas is more if you want really persist it over time across the studio and have this is the standard. We're a small studio. Like I said, we reiterate a lot. So before I might look into doing schemas, I might just first have the attributes for a production and then see if that's actually what we need, and then start designing schemas. But for now, I haven't done that now.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I think there's 2 in the back.
I had to take the hats.
You have to take the hats. Yeah, anyone who asks a question is going to get a cool hat. And then it's a free-for-all to fight for it.
Thanks. Did you end up connecting your pipeline to a project management tool like ShotGrid or F-Track or something like that?
We use OpenPipe, which has integrations with Aftrack and with ShotGrid and with Kitsu and with Aquarium and with a lot of others. And they're also building one of their own, in a way. Anyway, we use that, and that has plugins that basically say if you publish something, that will publish to Aftrack. In this case, we had it set up with Aftrack, and it would publish whenever we published a note to Aftrack and say, hey, this is the new version, and stuff like that. Was there any other specific thing you wanted specifically about USD on your Aftrack management, or?
No, it's more also if you your pipeline can pull the data from the project management tool. So if you're for example, you have the frame ranges for a shot in, let's say, ShotGrid, and that you can push it from there to your pipeline?
Yes, yeah, the AYON completely supports that. Yeah, it's not necessarily related to USD, but it does have a database where you can just set the frame ranges, FPS, resolution, and have that also be validated for your scenes. If you make new scenes, it will by default set your scenes up for that and stuff like that. I hope that answers the question. I don't think we have a lot of time, so I just want to go to this slide in advance, but feel free to continue questions in a bit. But there's more AYON presentations coming up the next 2 days. These are very interesting, so if you like this, I would definitely recommend going there. If you really like me, I'll be in the panel on Friday as well. What was the other question?
Oh, yeah. I'm a student at a school, and we're really trying to ditch alembics in our pipeline, really trying to. But we're running into some issues with the Maya stock USD exporter, which, you know, it's a bit of a struggle getting our only animated geometry out, because often also all the rigs come out, and then everything comes out without geometry. We were wondering if you could share a little bit about your workflow with that, and if you were also struggling with getting that to work.
Yeah. So you're having issues with Maya. I wouldn't have expected that. Just kidding. No, the Maya USD exporter has a USD exporter where if you have geometry native to Maya, which is just Maya geometry, and you export that, it exports the whole data. You can disable materials, but it will include the UVs, it will include the geometry itself. It might include the rig if the rig is embedded in that, but it can't export the full rig. So there's two ways you can just say, okay, I just want to have the geometry, like the point positions. There's two ways you can do that. You can add a Python chaser, which is like a custom script or plugin or add-on that runs after the export in memory before it writes the file. And then you can strip certain data from the export, and then you can basically remove what you don't want, so that in the end you just get the geometry. I think I have on my GitHub, my gists, I think I have some examples on how to use that, for example, to export only materials and their assignments without the geometry. That's one case that we looked into. Another case would be, like you described, just from animation, only export the point precisions and do not override the UVs, because I want the UVs to be completely controlled by, for example, the modeling department. So you can do that, but you would need to write a Python chaser. The other strategy would be to work with USD proxy shapes. But you can, I'm not sure how much you can push your rig into that, but basically the Maya USD proxy shapes also has the layering structure, and there you can save the layers. So if you're able to get your data there into the layer in the way you want, then essentially it's just saving the layer and you have the same data. But then you'll probably hit the same issue that if you merge your Maya data into that Maya proxy shape, that by default it will likely include everything. So yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Any other questions?
There are more questions. I just want to say that before you leave, we are running out of hats, but there are still T-shirts available, so you can pick up the T-shirts after the talk. And we'll be more than happy to see you wearing them on Friday and joining the panel discussion with us. Okay.
How were you able to sell this to your production department? Because, I mean, Houdini costs extra and you had a working pipeline.
Very good question. I'm one of the founders. I don't care if artists cry in the corner. I just want to do what I want. No, it's a very good question, actually. We had a good relationship with Side Effects. We knew their support. I contacted them about having like a time to just test it out. They provided up for like a startup ramp-up time, like some extra licenses to just test out the workflow to see if our artists would actually want to do this in the end. So I think we had like a few weeks ramp-up time to just, before purchasing, are we going to try this? And at some point I sat down with the other co-founders, okay, well, this is the investment we're going to make. Do we think it's going to be worthwhile? Even if we were to drop it, will we be fine with ditching the money? And he said, well, it's interesting development. USD is here to stay, so it's definitely a development we need to go into anyway. So why not now? Like many other studios, I feel like people had less work over the last few months. We kind of had the same in January, February. We still had projects, but not as much as we used to have, which is ramping up now again. But that was actually pretty lucky because it gave me the time to not handle the production stress and just spend time doing this instead of 90% production stress. So that's why I was able to push this out in a few weeks. Yeah.
How many licenses do you need extra?
I think we have 5 Houdini licenses now, 1 FX and 4 core licenses. Whenever it's rendering on the farm, through Husk, it doesn't cost you any licenses.
Thank you.
And I would like to also take this opportunity to invite you for tomorrow's presentation of Orca, because I can see Lorenzo here. He will be taking the presentation tomorrow, and it's a studio with a completely different setup and completely different structure, and you will see how AYON can help you in terms of the completely different workflows like cloud-based studio for cloud-based studio. There is one more question over there.
Cool. Just keep asking questions. I think they have a lot of shirts. They'll kick us out at some point, I think.
Hello, and do we have time?
Yes.
We have time, yeah. Thank you, as everyone else. Really interesting. Just a tiny curious about the workflow you kind of explained. So you're doing the assembly of all the models and stuff in Solaris, but then for the layout, is that still done in Maya by the animators, more or less?
Yeah, I very briefly mentioned that we don't really have a layout department because we're so small. It's mostly that there's like a list of assets that need to be in a shot. And those assets are pretty easily findable in like the loader that AYON offers. And usually it's just the artist, either there's a template for the project that by default loads whatever you need in the shot, or they need to load 4 assets, which is quite trivial. So what usually happened in Maya is that they would just like load the rigs and props. And previously with our Alembic pipeline, we would just cache that out from the rigs automatically, and from the props, they could pick whatever they wanted to export. Now, because we still basically have that same workflow in Maya, but because you need to put the geometry cache from the animation on top of the asset, because that has the look dev, that's why we needed to do that somewhere. And Solaris is just a easier way to debug that, but it also is procedural, which means that we also had a step where if we knew that it was just certain parts that were updated, we just had one button that would just update the assembly scene without opening it like interactively. It would just go on the farm, open scene, update everything, publish. So if the artist that just wanted to update the shot just to be safe, they could just run that on all the shots. It would just only update instead of adding new stuff, which could be automated. But then again, we're more looking into how we could potentially even remove that step or optimize it even further. Yeah. One question in front.
Another question.
Hi there. Do you see your utilization of USD extending to the compositing stage anytime soon?
To the what stage?
To the compositing stage.
The compositing stage. We use Fusion, which is, like I said, cheaper, not necessarily better. But it can also load Alembics, but we traditionally have rarely done that. Also because I'm not even sure if you can subdivide the geometry in Fusion after loading. And usually you wouldn't have the subdivided meshes in the Alembics, and thus the meshes would have differences from the render anyway. Likely you can. I have never actually had the need to do that. So yeah, I don't see it being used soon because we've never done that. Technically, because I think Nuke already has that as well, that it can actually render through Hydra delegates and their USD data. I think Fusion has a USD integration since a few years as well. Haven't tested that either, but technically what would be possible is to load the USD shot and render it completely with Arnold through Fusion, because it's the same Hydra delegate. And I think even if you can manipulate any attribute of USD at a lower level, you can technically use Fusion or Nuke as Solaris equivalent or a Katana equivalent, because all you're actually doing is just authoring some metadata on a USD primitive, which is just nothing that's super trivial through the API, but at the lower level, that's actually all you need to make up these scenes. And of course, Houdini offers a lot of better tools for certain workflows, but you could use ditch Solaris and do it all in Nuke if you want. I've heard of performance issues in Nuke, I think, if you render a lot of heavy 3D scenes.
Thank you.
Cool.
So, any question? So, thank you, Roy, for your beautiful presentation and nice talk. And thank you.
Thank you.